Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So glad you could join us. Today, we're really getting into something critical, something that's not just headlines, but is actively, shaping Europe's future.
Absolutely.
We're taking that deep dive into the incredibly complex situation over there, thinking about Russia's big ambitions, the ongoing war in Ukraine, obviously, and this really tough search for peace and security.
It's a massive topic, and we've got some really fascinating source material to help us unpack it, pulled from a collection of excerpts, basically, called Europe.pdf.
Right. And our mission today for you listening is pretty straightforward.
Right.
Pull out the key insights, the most important bits from these documents. We want to give you a clear sense of the motivations, the just immense challenges, and the different ideas floating around for what European security could even look like moving forward.
And you'll see the sources themselves hint at some really stark differences in perspective, finding common ground. It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, the difficulty really comes through. Okay, so let's kick things off. Part one, maybe, looking at this grand ambition versus the reality on the ground. The sources talk about President Putin as a great power player. What does that actually mean, according to these texts?
Yeah.
And this idea that he believes he can win everything.
Yeah, that's a really key place to start. The sources, they don't just portray him as like a standard political leader. It's more about someone driven by a sense of, well, historical destiny almost. When they say great power player who wants to win everything, it's pointing to this deep belief that Russia should be dominant, especially in Europe, aiming for that red carpet reception, as the source puts it.
Red carpet reception.
Right, and it gets deeper. They bring up Alexander Dugin, described as an ultra-imperialist philosopher, and the source connects his ideas directly, saying, regarding this expansionist vision, Putin must do that.
Must do that. Wow.
Exactly. It's not just should or could, it's must. That suggests it's seen less as a policy choice and more as a fundamental imperative, almost non-negotiable from their perspective.
So it's less about calculation and more about conviction, maybe even destiny.
That seems to be the implication in the source material, yeah.
Yeah.
Which, of course, leads to how they view the war in Ukraine.
Right. So it's not just about territory then.
Not according to these texts. It's framed more as an existential fight, a fight for Russia's own future, its identity, its place in the world.
Existential. That really raises the stakes.
Immensely. It suggests very little room for compromise on what they see as, well, fundamental issues. Makes any negotiation incredibly complex.
But then the sources bring in the ground truth, the internal challenges. How does that contrast work? What's the biggest internal pressure mentioned?
Yeah, the contrast is stark. The documents are pretty blunt about the problems. You've got a weak economy, significant short manning, basically, not enough people.
Right. Personnel issues.
Exactly. And even desertion within the military. These aren't small things. They're structural problems that really impact the ability to sustain a long, intense conflict.
So this grand vision meets these very real human and economic limits. And there's that fascinating poll number in the source, too. 50% of Russians preferring talks, but then almost 30%, 29% specifically, saying no peace until Russia gets everything it wants. What does that split tell us?
It paints a picture of a really difficult internal dynamic. Putin's pushing this grand vision, but there's clearly war weariness, economic strain. Yet there's also that significant hardline faction. So the internal pressures don't necessarily stop him, but they definitely complicate things. The sources suggest this might make the long game even more critical for him needing to outlast the internal pressures, perhaps, or maybe push for a quicker win to satisfy the hardliners and stop the drain. It's a tightrope.
A tightrope walk. That makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears. Pivot to Ukraine's side of this, the central question for them. How do you secure the future? The sources talk a lot about security guarantees, but they call it an elusive concept. Why elusive?
History. That's the short answer, and the sources really underline this. You absolutely have to remember the Budapest Memorandum from 1994.
Right, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons.
Its huge nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world at the time, in return for assurances from the US, UK, and crucially, Russia itself.
And those assurances
didn't hold up. The sources are clear. They proved insufficient. And then you have Minsk II later on, another agreement that, well, didn't bring lasting security.
So Ukraine's been down this road before with promises on paper.
Exactly. That history casts a long shadow. It explains the skepticism, why they're pushing so hard for something truly concrete now. They know promises can evaporate.
Understandably. So given that history, what concrete proposals are being discussed in these sources?
Well, there are a few. The sources mention German Chancellor Scholz's idea, back on August 10th, for concrete security guarantees involving Western powers EU, US, UK. And then there's another concept floated by a US official, Steve Witkoff, an Article 4-like protection.
Okay, Article 4-like. What does that actually mean in practice compared to, say, NATO's Article 5?
Yeah.
The sources seem to draw a clear line there.
They do, and it's a crucial distinction. Article 5 is the bedrock of NATO, attack one, attack all, automatic military response.
Elected defense.
Right. But the sources state very clearly that NATO countries are really hesitant to give Ukraine Article 5. Why? Because that likely means direct war with Russia.
Which everyone wants to avoid.
Precisely. So this Article 4-like idea, as Witkoff described it, would involve consultations if Ukraine is attacked. Keyword, consultations. Not necessarily an automatic fight.
So talking, coordinating, maybe support, but not that automatic trigger.
Exactly. It's an attempt to find a middle path. But the risk, kind of implied in the sources, is twofold. Is it strong enough for Ukraine, given their history? And how does Russia see it? Maybe as a weaker, less credible commitment, leaving Ukraine vulnerable. It's trying to thread a very difficult needle.
Trying to provide real protection without starting World War III, essentially.
That's the core challenge.
And it's even more complex because, as you mentioned, not everyone's even on board with giving any kind of formal guarantees. The sources mention this unnamed NATO official.
Yeah, that's a striking quote from August 19th.
Saying that giving specific guarantees to a non-member like Ukraine would be very insulting to Russia, potentially provoking them more.
It really highlights the divisions, doesn't it? Even among allies. There's this fear, held by some, that trying to secure Ukraine could actually backfire and escalate things with Russia.
It's a real catch-22. The very act of trying to ensure security is seen by some as potentially undermining it.
It's a diplomatic minefield, managing those perceptions and deep-seated fears.
Okay, so with all these problems, the history, the Article 5 reluctance, the divisions among allies, maybe it's no wonder the sources explore another route, this cohesion of the willing.
Exactly. It's framed as an alternative, moving beyond formal treaties.
So what does this cohesion of the willing look like?
It's not a formal alliance like NATO. Think more of a flexible group, a coalition of nations ready to step up if Ukraine is attacked again. The commitment would be to provide serious support, military aid, equipment, training, intelligence sharing, robust practical help.
Okay.
And the sources note this isn't just theoretical, it's being actively considered for U.S. military planning. There's even a working group mentioned with Senators Rubio, Graham, Shaheen involved.
So it's a serious proposal for providing real backing, but without that Article 5 tripwire.
That seems to be the goal, trying to offer substantial support that doesn't automatically pull guarantors into a direct conflict.
But naturally, there's a potential downside mentioned, too.
Oh, wait.
The fear that Russia might just see this as, well, weak. That Ukraine becomes, in the source's words, an enfeebled vassal state cut off from its allies. Not truly protected, just sort of propped up.
Right. It's that perception problem again. Does this model provide genuine deterrence, or does it signal a lack of full commitment, leaving Ukraine in a dangerous gray zone?
You know, what's really fascinating, stepping back, is how this cohesion of the willing idea reflects this almost desperate search for something that works in today's fractured world.
Yeah.
It's trying to balance the need to help Ukraine defend itself with the absolute imperative, for many, of avoiding a direct NATO-Russia war.
And looking at the map provided in the source material, seeing the geography, the areas under Russian control, it just hammers home the urgency, doesn't it? The stakes of getting this right or wrong.
Absolutely. Every decision, every proposal is playing out on that very real, very contested landscape.
It really is quite something. Seeing these huge historical ambitions clash with mundane things like manpower shortages.
And then watching the world tie itself in knots over the difference between Article 4 and Article 5, or devising these complex new models like the cohesion of the willing. So after diving through all this, what does it all mean? We've looked at the big picture ambitions, the tough realities on the ground, these intricate, sometimes contradictory efforts to build some kind of security.
I think the clearest takeaway is just how uncertain everything remains. There are no easy paths forward. The sources really paint a picture of a system in flux where old rules are being challenged and new ones haven't fully formed yet.
Definitely no easy answers, which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given the history we talked about, Budapest, Minsk II, guarantees that didn't guarantee much, and this ongoing struggle to define Ukraine's place, What is the responsibility of global powers to actually ensure a nation's sovereignty?
And maybe even deeper, in a time like this, when basic ideas about international law and borders seem up for grabs, how do you even begin to build, or maybe rebuild, trust? This question goes way beyond Ukraine, really. It forces us all to think about the foundations of stability in the 21st century, something to definitely keep pondering.